Garrett, a ruthless millionaire, recognizes a haunting melody at a lavish party and forces Abigail, a waitress, to perform it in an attempt to humiliate her. But when her performance stirs something deep within him, their encounter spirals into an unexpected journey. What begins as a moment of cruelty unravels into a shared secret that could change both their lives forever. The constant hum of city life outside was a reminder of an unrelenting world. Yet in a small, dimly lit corner of the city, time seemed to slow. Abigail sat quietly, resting her violin on her shoulder, the bow hovering above the strings. She exhaled deeply, her fingers gently caressing the familiar wood as they prepared to bring the melody to life. Her music told a story, one of longing, resilience, and a deep connection to the grandfather who had gifted her this precious violin. The instrument, though worn and weathered with age, held a special place in her heart. It wasn't just an object, it was a vessel of memories and dreams. Her grandfather, a musician in a modest community orchestra, had given her the violin before he passed. His parting words stayed with her. "This violin is more than just wood and strings, Abigail. It's a bridge to your dreams. Keep playing, and it will lead you somewhere incredible." For Abigail, the violin was a beacon of hope in a life that was anything but easy. Her parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, her mother as a seamstress and her father as a carpenter. Life in their city was a stark contrast between charm and struggle. While tourists marveled at its beauty, families like Abigail's lived in its shadows, barely scraping by. Despite their efforts, there was never enough to send Abigail to a prestigious music academy or afford a better violin. All she had was the gift her grandfather left behind and the hope that her talent would one day be recognized. By day, Abigail worked as a waitress in an upscale restaurant frequented by the city's elite. She served people who casually discussed luxurious vacations and designer brands as though they were mundane. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, she felt like a silent observer in a world she didn't belong to. Still, no matter how long her shift ran, she never missed her nightly practice. After work, she'd quietly sneak into a small room in her family's home, careful not to wake her exhausted parents. In those late hours, when the city finally slept, she poured her soul into the violin. Her music was her escape, a release from the heavy burden of responsibility and the anxiety that came with financial struggles. It was in those moments, alone with her violin, that she felt truly alive. But dreams don't pay bills, and opportunity didn't come knocking. Despite her relentless practice, rejection letters from music schools piled up. Each one was a painful reminder that talent wasn't always enough. Yet, Abigail refused to give up. As long as she could play, she believed there was hope. Late at night, after her practice, Abigail would stare out of her window at the city below. She dreamed of a life filled with music, applause, and bright lights. A life where her talent was celebrated. For now, though, she was just a waitress with a dream. The following evening, the grand ballroom of the Whitman estate was alive with luxury. The golden glow of chandeliers illuminated the opulence, from the polished marble floors to the gilded mirrors that reflected the glamour of the evening. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled effortlessly, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. At the center of it all was Garrett Whitman, a man who commanded attention without trying. He was impeccably dressed, his every move exuding confidence and power. His smile, though charming, carried an edge, calculated and distant, never quite reaching his eyes. Unbeknownst to the glittering crowd, a humble waitress would soon transform the evening. Abigail, thrust into the spotlight under humiliating circumstances, would let her music speak louder than words. In doing so, she would remind everyone that brilliance can come from the most unexpected places. Garrett Whitman had been born into a life of luxury, and it showed in everything he did. Privilege fit him like a tailored suit, one that emphasized his confidence and control. From the way his bespoke attire framed his broad shoulders, to how people eagerly hung on his every word, Garrett exuded power. His reputation preceded him, an enigmatic figure who could elevate or destroy fortunes with a single decision. Tonight, he was hosting one of his legendary soirees, gatherings that drew Savannah's wealthiest residents like moths to a flame. These events weren't just parties. They were opportunities for Garrett to showcase his opulence and remind everyone of his influence. Every detail of the evening had been meticulously arranged, from the exquisite gourmet dishes to the orchestra playing soft melodies that underscored the hum of refined conversation. The city's elite moved about the grand ballroom as if the world existed solely for their enjoyment. For Abigail, the evening carried an entirely different tone. She was part of the invisible workforce that made events like this possible. Dressed in a plain black uniform, she moved silently through the crowd, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and refilling champagne glasses. She had worked at several of these events before, and every time, the extravagance left her feeling like a stranger in an alien world, a world she could never hope to belong to. As she wove her way through the glittering crowd, she caught fragments of conversations. Guests spoke casually of summer homes on the coast, lavish trips to Europe, and triumphs in the stock market. Each word only served to highlight the vast chasm between their lives and hers. For Abigail, a week's excitement might consist of scraping together enough money to replace the worn strings on her beloved violin. She tried her best to remain unnoticed, her gaze fixed downward and her movements deliberate. But as fate would have it, Garrett's piercing eyes eventually landed on her. He was mid-conversation with a group of well-dressed businessmen when he noticed the young woman moving quietly through the room. Something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was the efficiency of her movements, or the faint weariness in her expression. It was a look he'd seen before, on people struggling under the weight of responsibilities far greater than they deserved. Whatever it was, a spark of amusement flickered in Garrett's eyes. He relished moments like these, when he could remind others of their place in the world, his world. His voice cut through the chatter around him. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough to halt her in her tracks. Abigail's heart skipped a beat as she glanced up, her eyes locking with Garrett's for a fleeting moment before she quickly looked away. She'd been warned about him, his sharp wit, his arrogance, and his tendency to make others the butt of his cruel jokes. She approached him cautiously, her hands steady despite the growing knot of dread in her stomach. When she reached him, Garrett flashed a smile that didn't feel welcoming. It was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with an undertone she couldn't quite place. "Abigail," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice even. "Abigail," he repeated, as if savoring the sound. "Tell me, Abigail, what do you do when you're not serving drinks?" She hesitated, unsure if honesty was the right approach, but lying felt equally risky. "I play the violin," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's smile widened, and a flicker of something sinister crossed his face. "The violin? How delightful!" He turned to the group around him, his voice growing louder. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a musician among us." Laughter rippled through the crowd, not out of genuine amusement, but out of the obligation to humor him. Abigail's cheeks flushed as she felt the weight of their stares, heavy with judgment and curiosity. She gripped her tray tighter, wishing she could disappear into the background. Leaning in slightly, Garrett's voice took on a quieter, more intimate tone, though it only heightened her discomfort. "Why don't you show us, Abigail? There's a violin with the orchestra's set, right over there. Surely you can entertain us with a little performance." The room seemed to shrink as Abigail's breath quickened. Her throat felt tight and her palms began to sweat. She glanced toward the orchestra's instruments, her mind racing. She didn't know how to refuse someone like Garrett, but every fiber of her being screamed against what he was asking. Garrett's smile persisted, a glint of amusement in his eyes as he awaited her response. For him, this was a game, a chance to assert his dominance. For Abigail, It was a moment that could change everything. She didn't want to do this. Not here, not now, and certainly not in front of these people. But refusing Garrett Whitman wasn't an option. Nobody said no to him, not without consequences. The silence that followed his challenge pressed down on Abigail like a weight. Every gaze in the room was fixed on her, waiting to see what she would do. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might leap out of her chest, and her palms were damp as they clutched the tray of champagne flutes. This was supposed to be a quiet evening, another shift where she faded into the background. But now, she stood at the center of everyone's attention, not by choice, but because of Garrett's whim. Her eyes darted toward the orchestra, where a violin rested on its stand, gleaming under the chandelier's light. It wasn't her violin, the one her grandfather had lovingly passed down to her, the one she knew, like the back of her hand. This one felt foreign, a stranger's tool. The thought of playing it made her stomach churn. She didn't want to perform, especially not for this crowd, with their cold, judgmental stares and unspoken expectation of her failure. The heat of embarrassment crept up her neck, coloring her cheeks. Garrett stood nearby, his sharp smile unchanged, his gaze unwavering. His amusement at her discomfort was obvious, and it was clear he wasn't making a request. This was a command, one he knew she couldn't refuse. "Go on, Abigail," he said, his voice light, but with an edge of something more sinister. "Show us what you've got." Laughter rippled through the group around him, and Abigail flinched. She could hear the condescension in their tones, the subtle mockery that wasn't even hidden. For them, this was part of the evening's entertainment. To humiliate someone like her was just another way to pass the time. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, Abigail set her tray down on a nearby table. She wiped her clammy hands on her apron, her legs trembling as she stepped toward the orchestra. Each step felt heavier than the last, the distance to the violin stand seeming to stretch endlessly before her. When she finally reached it, she picked up the violin carefully, her fingers brushing against the strings as she adjusted her grip. It felt unfamiliar and awkward in her hands, so different from her own treasured instrument. She turned to face the crowd, their eyes bearing down on her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disdain. She could almost hear their thoughts. What could someone like her possibly have to offer? Off to the side, Garrett leaned casually against a pillar, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold. His expression made it clear he was savoring the moment. Abigail closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. But the urge to run was almost overwhelming. But she couldn't. If she fled, it would give Garrett exactly what he wanted, her complete humiliation. She couldn't let that happen. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, a memory she clung to. "This violin is your bridge, Abigail. It will take you where you need to go." Taking another deep breath, she steadied her shaking hands and lifted the bow to the strings. The room was utterly still, the anticipation so thick it was suffocating. She could feel the thundering of her own heartbeat, but she forced herself to focus on the music. The first note was soft, hesitant. It wavered slightly as it filled the air, not quite right. Her hands were stiff, her grip too tight as nerves fought to overtake her. But then, as the melody began to take shape, something shifted inside her. Her muscles loosened, her breathing steadied, and her bow hand moved more fluidly. She began to lose herself in the song, the one her grandfather had taught her long ago. It was a piece she turned to in her darkest moments. A melody that spoke of both sorrow and hope. As the notes flowed from the violin, the room began to change. The mocking laughter and whispers that had filled the air earlier had faded into silence. The music was no longer just sound, it was raw emotion, pouring out of Abigail's heart and soul and into the space around her. Her eyes remained closed as she played, the crowd and the grandeur of the ballroom melting away. In this moment, it was just her and the violin. Nothing else mattered. The melody swept through the room like a soft breeze, touching everyone present in a way they hadn't anticipated. Even Garrett, who had stood with a smug smile moments earlier, found his expression shifting. The arrogance slipped away, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. A flicker of vulnerability, perhaps even regret. The music stirred something deep within him, something buried so far down that its reemergence caught him off guard. It was as if the notes awakened a forgotten memory, one he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. Abigail played on, oblivious to the change in the atmosphere. For her, this wasn't just a performance. It was an escape, a release, a way to say all the things she could never articulate with words. Each note carried the weight of her struggles and the depth of her dreams. By the time the last note hung in the air, the room was transformed. Silence followed, but it wasn't the awkward, expectant kind. It was heavy, profound, filled with a quiet reverence that no one dared disturb. For a brief, shining moment, Abigail had done more than just play music. She had touched their souls. She didn't care about the audience anymore. This wasn't for them, it was for her. This was her moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. As the last note dissolved into silence, Abigail slowly lowered the violin. Her breathing was heavy, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, the room remained utterly still. She opened her eyes, bracing herself to meet the crowd's gaze. She expected the same judgment, the same quiet disdain she'd felt earlier. But instead, there was nothing. No laughter, no whispered mockery, just silence. Then, like a single raindrop before a storm, the sound of applause broke the stillness. It started hesitantly, as if the audience wasn't quite sure how to react. But soon, it grew, swelling into a resounding ovation that filled the grand room. Abigail stood frozen, the violin still in her hands, as she struggled to process what was happening. She had braced herself for ridicule, prepared to endure their condescension. But this was something she hadn't anticipated. The applause washed over her like a wave, disorienting and surreal. Her gaze darted across the room, catching glimpses of faces she had been serving drinks to just minutes ago. They were on their feet now, clapping with genuine admiration. Some guests even wiped tears from their eyes, visibly moved by the haunting beauty of her performance. Abigail's chest tightened as an unfamiliar emotion welled up inside her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been praised like this, if she ever had been. Her days were usually filled with rejection letters and a nagging voice in the back of her mind, telling her that her dreams were too far out of reach. Yet here she was, in this room of opulence, being seen not as a waitress, but as an artist. For the first time, they saw her for what she was, not what she did. Her fingers tightened around the violin, as though afraid the moment might vanish if she let go. But then, a voice cut through the applause, cold and deliberate. "Bravo!" Garrett Whitman said, his tone carrying an unsettling weight. Abigail's chest tightened as she looked toward him. His slow, deliberate clapping stood in stark contrast to the enthusiasm of the crowd. His once amused smile was gone, replaced by an unreadable expression that sent a chill down her spine. Garrett stepped closer, his movements deliberate as the crowd began to quiet. Abigail's heart raced faster as his presence loomed larger, the rest of the room fading into the background, his sharp eyes locked onto hers. And this time, the mockery she had seen earlier was absent. Instead, there was something else, something darker and more serious. "That was unexpected," he said, his voice low, meant only for her ears. The teasing edge in his tone had vanished, leaving behind a strange curiosity. "You're quite the hidden talent, Abigail." She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to feel proud, to bask in the validation she'd craved for so long. But the intensity of Garrett's gaze made her uneasy. This was the same man who had set her up to fail, the same man who had tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. And now he was looking at her as if her performance had shifted something within him, something even he hadn't expected. Before she could say anything, Garrett turned back to the room, his voice commanding as he addressed the crowd. "It seems we've been treated to an impromptu performance by an unexpected virtuoso," he said, his polished tone as smooth as ever. "Let's give her another round of applause." The crowd complied, clapping once again, this time with a mixture of admiration and lingering surprise. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks as the applause swirled around her. But her focus remained on Garrett. Something about his demeanor unsettled her. She couldn't tell if he was still playing his game or if her music had genuinely caught him off guard. Just then, the crowd parted, and a figure emerged from the throng, a man with silver hair and a quiet authority that commanded attention. His presence was calm but purposeful, and his eyes never left Abigail as he approached. The applause was just beginning to fade when he approached her, offering a soft but genuine smile. His expression carried something deeper than kindness, an unmistakable hint of awe. "You play beautifully," the man said, his voice warm yet firm, the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm Leonard Chastain, conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Abigail's breath hitched, her heart skipping a beat. Leonard Chastain. She knew that name. Everyone in the world of classical music did. He was a legend, a figure whose opinion could shape careers with a single sentence. And now, impossibly, he was standing in front of her, speaking directly to her. I'm Abigail," she stammered, her voice shaky as she struggled to form words. Standing before someone of his stature made her feel impossibly small. "I know," Chastain replied with a gentle smile. "I've had the privilege of hearing many talented musicians over the years, but rarely have I heard someone play with the depth and emotion you just demonstrated. You have a gift, Abigail, one that shouldn't be confined to this room or hidden away in a restaurant." His words struck her like a wave, each syllable crashing over her and leaving her reeling. Was this real? Was Leonard Chastain truly offering her the validation she'd spent her entire life dreaming of? "I'd like to invite you to audition for a position with my orchestra," he continued, his voice taking on a serious tone. "I believe you could be something extraordinary." Abigail's mind spun as she tried to process what he was saying. This couldn't be real, an opportunity straight out of her wildest dreams, unfolding right here, in this grand ballroom filled with people who had once looked down on her. Behind her, Garrett stood silently, watching the exchange. His earlier attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, and now Abigail was being offered the chance of a lifetime by one of the most influential figures in classical music. His expression was unreadable, but Abigail could sense the shift. For the first time that evening, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within her. Hope. Not the fragile kind she had carried for so long, but something real, something tangible. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something extraordinary. The weight of Leonard Chastain's words lingered in the air even after the applause had faded. Abigail stood motionless, clutching the violin, her thoughts racing to catch up with the moment. The words, "audition for the New York Philharmonic," echoed in her mind, feeling too surreal, too impossible to be meant for her. A waitress who played violin in the quiet corners of her life. The room, once alive with chatter and movement, seemed to hold its breath. Guests exchanged glances, their whispered conversations spreading like wildfire. They had all witnessed what should have been an embarrassing display transform into an unexpected triumph. And now, the girl they had ignored moments ago stood at the center of it all, her talent undeniable. Abigail's heart pounded as she looked back at Leonard. The offer he was extending was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had convinced herself she might never achieve. And yet, disbelief gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Why would someone like him take an interest in her? She had no formal training, no prestigious pedigree, just an old violin and a stubborn dream. She began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Leonard replied, his smile reassuring. "Take some time to think about it." "But I meant what I said, Abigail. You have something rare, something that can't be taught. I see potential in you that goes beyond technical skill. When you're ready, we'll arrange an audition." Her mouth felt dry, and her hands, still holding the violin, trembled slightly. How could she possibly turn this down? The chance to audition for one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world wasn't something that came along every day. But doubt whispered in the back of her mind. What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm making a mistake? She swallowed hard and forced herself to nod. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Thank you so much." Leonard nodded in return, a spark of encouragement in his eyes. "We'll be in touch, Abigail. And remember, don't let anyone tell you that you're not worthy of this. You've earned it." With that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, his figure blending into the sea of elegant suits and glittering gowns. Abigail remained standing where she was, the violin still in her hands, the weight of his words, and the promise of what they could mean sinking in. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream a little bigger. Abigail stood still, clutching the violin tightly as the weight of the room's attention pressed on her. The reality of what had just happened was starting to settle in, bringing with it a surge of emotions: excitement, fear, hope, and disbelief, all swirling together until she felt almost lightheaded. With great care, she placed the violin back on its stand, her fingers lingering on the strings for a moment. Though it wasn't hers, this instrument had become a bridge to something she'd never dared to imagine. An opportunity that could change her life forever. As she straightened, her gaze swept across the room. Standing a few feet away, Garrett Whitman was watching her. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but his piercing eyes were fixed on her. Gone was the smug look he'd worn earlier. Now, his face carried something else, something she couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another, the tension between them thick and palpable. Abigail wasn't sure what to expect, an apology, perhaps, or more of his condescending mockery. But then, his lips curled into a small, tight smile. "Well," he said, his voice low and measured, "it seems I underestimated you." Abigail blinked, caught off guard by his words. She hadn't expected him to admit that, not after the way he had treated her earlier. A part of her wanted to be angry, to call him out for trying to humiliate her in front of all those people. But another part of her, the part still riding the high of her unexpected triumph, couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. "You didn't think I'd be any good," she said, her voice steady now as she began to regain her composure. Garrett's faint smile faltered, but his gaze never wavered. "I suppose I didn't," he admitted, his tone quieter now, carrying the slightest hint of regret. "But you proved me wrong." For a brief moment, there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of respect perhaps? Abigail couldn't tell, and truthfully, she didn't care to dwell on it. She had her own emotions to process, her own doubts to wrestle with. Before she could reply, one of the other guests approached Garrett, drawing his attention away. He glanced at her one last time before turning and disappearing into the crowd, leaving her standing there alone. The orchestra resumed playing, their music filling the space where the heavy silence had been just moments ago. Abigail took a deep breath, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process the enormity of what had just unfolded. She had walked into this event as a waitress, expecting nothing more than another night of blending into the background, serving guests who wouldn't even remember her name, but she was leaving with something extraordinary, an offer that could change everything. As she made her way toward the exit, weaving through the glittering crowd with far more ease than when she had arrived, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Could she really do this? Was she ready? Doubts lingered, gnawing at the edges of her newfound hope. But beneath those doubts, a small, steady flicker of belief remained. For the first time in what felt like forever, the dream of becoming a violinist didn't seem so distant. It felt real. It felt possible. Meanwhile, Garrett Whitman couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him since Abigail's performance. He had never been the type to dwell on emotions. his own or anyone else's. Emotions, in his world, were messy, unpredictable, and far too risky to indulge. But tonight, something about Abigail's music had stirred something in him, something he wasn't entirely prepared to confront. As the night continued and the ballroom returned to its usual rhythm of chatter and champagne, Garrett found himself glancing toward the door where she had disappeared. For reasons he couldn't quite name, he suspected this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Garrett Whitman had built his empire on cold, calculated decisions, never allowing emotions to interfere with his judgment. But tonight, something had shifted. That melody, there was something about it that stirred a deep, long-buried part of himself. As the evening wore on and guests mingled, congratulating him on yet another successful event, Garrett found himself retreating to the edge of the room. The polite conversations around him blurred into background noise as his thoughts wandered. He kept returning to the image of Abigail standing there with the violin, her fingers gliding across the strings with such ease and raw emotion. It had been years, decades even, since music had moved him like that. And yet, that melody had gripped him, refusing to let go. It was hauntingly familiar, tugging at the corners of his memory in a way that made him uneasy. At first, he couldn't understand why it felt so significant, why it seemed to echo with pieces of his past. But as the night progressed, fragments began to emerge, unbidden, from the places in his mind he had locked away. Garrett moved toward the large windows at the far end of the ballroom, distancing himself from the crowd. His eyes scanned the Savannah skyline, the city lights stretching endlessly into the night. But his mind wasn't on the present. It was elsewhere, back in his childhood home. He saw the dimly lit living room, where his mother used to play the piano late into the night. The memory was vivid, almost tangible. He could almost hear the soft, melodic notes that used to fill their home, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. His mother had been the one person in his life who truly understood him, who saw beyond the layers of arrogance and ambition he would later cultivate. She had been gentle, kind, and immensely talented. Music was her way of expressing the emotions she couldn't always articulate. Garrett had spent countless evenings sitting by her side, captivated as her fingers danced across the piano keys, creating melodies that felt like magic. But that was before the accident, before everything changed. The memory hit him with a force that made his chest tighten. His mother's death had been sudden, a car accident that tore her away when he was still a teenager. In the aftermath, Garrett had buried his grief under layers of ambition, throwing himself into his father's business and learning to navigate the world with ruthless determination. He had convinced himself that needing anyone was a weakness, and so he let the music die with her. Until tonight. Abigail's performance had cracked open the walls he had so carefully built. The melody she played, it wasn't just familiar, it was the same. The exact tune his mother used to play, a composition she had created but never shared beyond their home. How was that possible? How could Abigail have known it? The realization gnawed at him, unsettling and mysterious. It felt like an impossibility, and yet there it was. A strange sense of connection began to take root, one he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the music. It was the way she had played, as if she understood the weight of it, as if she had poured her entire soul into those notes. Garrett clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides as he stared out at the city lights. He didn't like this feeling, this vulnerability, this exposure. He had spent years locking his emotions away, perfecting a life where control was absolute. But now, that control was slipping, and he didn't know how to handle it. He thought back to the way Abigail had looked while she played, her eyes closed, her expression serene, her entire being focused on the music, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The image lingered in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake it. For the first time in years, Garrett felt something stir within him that he couldn't explain. And for a man who prided himself on having all the answers, that was a terrifying thought. She had played with a passion and depth that Garrett hadn't witnessed in years, perhaps ever. It wasn't just talent. Abigail possessed something rare, something extraordinary. And as much as he had tried to diminish her, to make her feel small in front of the crowd, she had proven him wrong in the most spectacular way. That realization brought a bitter taste to his mouth, but it wasn't bitterness alone. Beneath the sting of being outdone was something softer. Admiration, perhaps? Abigail embodied everything Garrett had lost in his relentless climb to success. She was pure, driven by something far deeper than ambition. And through her music, she had reminded him of the one person he had loved most in the world, his mother. Garrett turned away from the window, his thoughts swirling in a storm of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the pull Abigail had awakened in him. He needed to know more about her, to understand where she came from and how she had learned that melody. It couldn't be a coincidence. He was sure of that. For the first time in a very long time, Garrett felt a need to dig deeper, to uncover what had just transpired and why it had affected him so profoundly. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wouldn't be the last time he crossed paths with Abigail. She had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. And Garrett Whitman wasn't the type to walk away from a mystery, especially one that had the power to upend his carefully constructed world. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Abigail, as if her entire world had shifted overnight. The quiet, predictable life she had grown used to, the daily grind of waiting tables and practicing her violin in solitude, was suddenly turned upside down. After the performance at the Whitman estate, the invitation to audition for the New York Philharmonic wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. A dream she had spent years chasing suddenly felt closer than ever. But with that nearness came fear. The orchestra was legendary, and Leonard Chastain wasn't just any conductor. His name carried weight in the world of classical music. One word from him could open doors Abigail hadn't even known existed. Yet with the promise of those doors opening came the gnawing question: was she ready? Could she possibly live up to the expectations now placed upon her? Every night after her shift at the restaurant, Abigail would retreat to her small room, pick up her violin, and play until her fingers ached. But this time, the practice felt different. It wasn't just for her anymore. It was for something larger, something tangible. The stakes had never been higher, and with every note she played, she felt the weight of that reality pressing down on her. The doubts crept in, whispering in the back of her mind every time she picked up her bow. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? But there was no room to turn back now. Leonard Chastain had already set a date for her audition, and it was only a few weeks away. Time seemed to move faster with each passing day, until suddenly, Abigail found herself standing outside a rehearsal hall, clutching her violin case so tightly it felt like the only thing tethering her to the ground. The hall was modest, yet elegant, with its high ceilings and polished wooden floors that echoed every step she took. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. Leonard had arranged for her to rehearse with a group of musicians in preparation for her audition. Today was her first official session, a chance to refine her performance and prove, if only to herself, that she deserved to be there. But as she stepped inside and saw the other musicians setting up, the weight of it all hit her again. This wasn't just another practice session. It was the start of something far greater, and whether she succeeded or not would come down to her ability to rise above the fear and doubts that had shadowed her for so long. Her nerves flared up the moment she stepped inside. The room was filled with seasoned musicians, professionals who had spent years playing in orchestras. They barely acknowledged her presence as she entered, too absorbed in tuning their instruments and chatting amongst themselves. A wave of insecurity washed over Abigail, making her feel small. Who was she to be here among them? A waitress with no formal training, no prestigious background, and not even a proper violin. She quietly took her place at the far end of the room, carefully unpacking her grandfather's worn instrument. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the strings, her heart heavy with doubt. Surrounded by polished, expensive instruments and musicians with impeccable resumes, her violin felt inadequate. But it was all she had. When the rehearsal began, the conductor, a stern man with graying hair and a commanding presence, called for silence. Abigail focused intently on the sheet music in front of her, trying to drown out her nerves. But the moment the music started, it became painfully clear that she was out of her depth. The other musicians played with precision, their timing flawless, their sound rich and vibrant. Abigail, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. Her bow slipped awkwardly on the strings, her fingers faltered, and every mistake seemed amplified in the vast, echoing hall. Halfway through the session, the conductor paused, his sharp gaze settling on her. "Miss Abigail," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "You need to stay with the tempo. This isn't a solo performance. You must learn to blend with the orchestra." His words stung, but Abigail nodded quickly, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. She forced herself to try again, determined to do better. Yet the mounting pressure only seemed to amplify her mistakes. By the end of the rehearsal, her confidence had crumbled entirely. As the other musicians packed up and filed out of the room, Abigail quietly put her violin away, avoiding their gazes. She slipped out into the cold evening air, clutching her violin case tightly as she stood on the steps of the rehearsal hall. The doubts that had plagued her since the beginning now roared louder than ever. "I'm not ready for this. I don't belong here." These musicians had spent their lives immersed in music, training from a young age, their skills honed by years of experience. She, on the other hand, had spent her days waiting tables and practicing alone in a cramped room. What made her think she could compete with them? She felt the sting of tears, but quickly blinked them away, trying to steady her breathing. Then, cutting through her despair, a voice spoke. "Rough session?" Startled, Abigail looked up to see a woman in her mid-30s standing a few steps away, a cello case slung over her shoulder. The woman smiled warmly, her expression kind and understanding. Abigail hesitated before nodding. "Yeah," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I guess you could say that." The woman walked closer, leaning casually against the railing. "Don't let it get to you," she said gently. "We've all had bad days. And besides, you've got something most of us don't." Abigail blinked, confused. "What's that?" The woman smiled again, her voice soft but certain. "Heart. I heard it in your playing. Sure, you made some mistakes, but the way you play, you can tell it matters to you. That's not something you can teach." Abigail stared at her, the words sinking in slowly. Heart. She had always played from her heart, driven by her love for music and the memories tied to it. Maybe that was what had brought her this far, what had made someone like Leonard Chastain notice her in the first place. "Thanks," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. The woman gave her a reassuring nod before heading off into the night, leaving Abigail alone on the steps. As she stood there, the weight of her self-doubt began to ease, just a little. For the first time since the rehearsal began, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. "Thank you," Abigail said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I needed to hear that." The woman nodded and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading off into the night. Abigail stood alone on the steps, her violin case clutched tightly in her hands. The cold air brushed against her face, but it no longer felt as harsh. Her doubts were still there, lingering at the edges of her mind, but they didn't seem quite as overwhelming now. For the first time, she allowed herself to think, maybe, just maybe, I'm ready for this. Garrett sat in his office, a grand space filled with dark mahogany furniture and towering bookshelves. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Savannah's skyline, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Yet, Garrett's focus was elsewhere. For the past few days, he had buried himself in work, drowning in meetings, contracts, and endless emails. It was his go-to strategy whenever emotions threatened to surface. Stay busy, stay in control. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept circling back to her. Abigail. It wasn't just her performance that haunted him. That alone might have been easy to dismiss as a surprising moment of talent. No, it was the way her music had struck something deep within him, something he had long believed buried. For years, Garrett had told himself that emotions were a weakness, a liability that only led to pain. He had mastered the art of keeping the world at arm's length, building a life where nothing could touch him unless he allowed it. And yet, Abigail's music had slipped past his defenses effortlessly. The melody she played, the same one his mother had composed, had pulled him back into a part of himself he thought he had left behind. It brought memories he had locked away flooding back to the surface. Memories of a time before ambition consumed him, when he had allowed himself to feel, to care. For a brief moment, Abigail's music had made him human again. Garrett let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. He hated this feeling of conflict, this uncertainty. He was a man who thrived on decisiveness, who made choices quickly and without hesitation. But this was different. Abigail had awakened something in him, and he didn't know how to handle it. Over the past few days, his curiosity had gotten the better of him. Quietly, he had made inquiries through his network, piecing together fragments of her life. Abigail was the daughter of a seamstress and a carpenter, with no formal music education and no privileged background. She worked as a waitress during the day and played the violin at night. Despite her lack of resources, she possessed something rare, raw talent and passion that couldn't be bought or taught. But there was one question that continued to gnaw at him. How had she come to play the melody his mother had written? The melody wasn't widely known, wasn't something that should have made its way to Abigail. It couldn't be a coincidence. And yet, no matter how much he tried to make sense of it, the answer eluded him. A knock on the office door interrupted his thoughts. Garrett glanced up as his assistant, Rachel, peeked in. "Mr. Whitman, you have a call from Mr. Leonard Chastain," she said. Garrett straightened in his chair. Leonard Chastain, the man who had offered Abigail the chance of a lifetime at his event. Garrett hadn't spoken to him since that night. He nodded. "Put him through." Moments later, the familiar voice of the renowned conductor filled the room. "Garrett, it's Leonard." "Leonard," Garrett replied smoothly, leaning forward in his chair. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about Abigail," Leonard said, wasting no time. Garrett's brow furrowed slightly. "Abigail?" "Yes," Leonard continued. "I understand you've taken a particular interest in her." Garrett hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I wouldn't call it a particular interest. Let's say, I'm curious. She clearly has talent. That much was undeniable." Leonard chuckled softly. "More than talent, Garrett. She has something rare. I've rarely encountered someone with such raw potential and emotional depth who hasn't had formal training. That's why I extended an invitation for her to audition for the Philharmonic. But she's going to need support if she's going to succeed." "Support?" Garrett asked, narrowing his eyes. "She's talented, but she's unpolished," Leonard explained. "She's never had the proper resources or guidance to refine her skills. If she's going to step onto a stage as prestigious as ours, she'll need someone to help her along the way." Garrett leaned back in his chair, processing Leonard's words. Abigail had already proven she had the spark, the ability to connect with an audience in a way few musicians could. But Leonard was right. Raw talent alone wasn't enough. To thrive in the competitive world of classical music, she would need more. And yet, the idea of stepping in, of helping her in some way, left Garrett conflicted. Why did he care? Why was he so drawn to her journey? "I see," Garrett finally said, his voice calm and measured. "I assume you're calling because you think I can offer her that support." Leonard's chuckle came again, warm but firm. "You're a sharp man, Garrett. Let's just say I think Abigail's success could benefit from the kind of influence only someone like you can provide." Garrett didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the window as Leonard's words hung in the air. Something about Abigail's story and her music had already connected with him in a way he didn't fully understand. And now, the question lingered. What was he willing to do about it? "You and I both know how competitive the world of classical music is," Leonard said, his voice steady. "Talent alone isn't always enough. She's going to need more than just her violin and a dream if she's going to succeed." Garrett leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly tapping on the polished wood of his desk. "What exactly are you asking, Leonard?" "I'm asking if you're willing to help her," Leonard replied, his tone firm, yet without pressure. "You have the resources, the connections. What she needs is someone to believe in her, someone who can give her the opportunity she needs to grow into the artist she's meant to be." Garrett didn't respond immediately. This wasn't what he had expected. For days, he had been wrestling with his own feelings about Abigail, unsure of what to do next. And now Leonard was asking him to take an active role in shaping her future. It was an unfamiliar proposition. Garrett wasn't known for helping others. His reputation was built on his sharp business instincts and ability to close deals, not on being a benefactor. But as he sat there, Leonard's words resonated with something inside him. Abigail had awakened a part of him he thought was long gone. Maybe it was time to stop running from it. Maybe this was his chance to do something different. "I'll think about it," Garrett said finally, his voice even. "That's all I ask," Leonard replied, his tone softening. "She deserves a chance, and I believe you're the one who can help give it to her." After a few pleasantries, the call ended. Garrett sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over him. Could he really do this? Could he step into a role that required giving without expecting something in return? Supporting Abigail felt strange, but it also felt right. She had already changed something in him, and it seemed like this was the logical next step. For once, Garrett wasn't just considering his own interests. He had a choice to make, and for the first time, he was ready to make a decision that wasn't solely about himself. Garrett didn't waste any time after the phone call. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he couldn't stay on the sidelines. He wasn't the kind of man who let life happen to him. He had always taken charge, shaping events to suit his needs. But this time, it wasn't about him. It was about Abigail and what she could become if given the right support. The hardest part was the first step. He knew he had to face her. Garrett wasn't accustomed to admitting when he was wrong, but Abigail deserved that much. He had tried to humiliate her at his event, yet she had risen above it, with grace and raw talent. Her music had exposed truths he had buried for years, and now he felt compelled to make things right. It wasn't hard to find out where she lived. Her apartment was in a modest neighborhood, not far from the heart of Savannah. It was a world away from the luxury Garrett was used to, but as he approached the small building, he felt a strange mix of discomfort and determination. Her apartment reflected hard work and perseverance, a place where every detail seemed earned. Garrett parked his car and approached the door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. He wasn't sure how she would react to seeing him, or what he would say when she did. The door opened, and there she was. Abigail stood in the doorway, her violin case at her side as though she were just about to leave. Her expression shifted from surprise to something more guarded as soon as her eyes landed on him. "Garrett," she said, her tone neutral but with a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Garrett cleared his throat, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place he looked in his perfectly tailored suit, standing amidst the modest surroundings of her apartment complex. He wasn't used to feeling nervous. He had spent most of his life in control, unshakable. But here he was, standing awkwardly at Abigail's door, fully aware she had every reason to slam it in his face. "I came to talk," he said, keeping his tone steady, "about what happened at the event, and about what comes next." Abigail's brow furrowed, and for a moment, she simply stared at him, as if trying to decipher whether this was some kind of game. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense, before she finally stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. "All right," she said cautiously. "Let's talk." Garrett stepped into her small apartment, taking in the space around him. The living room was simple but warm, with little touches of personality sprinkled throughout. A photo of her family rested on the mantel, and sheet music lay scattered across the worn coffee table. Even in this humble space, it was clear how much of her life revolved around music. Abigail sat on the edge of her couch, her posture tense, her arms resting lightly on her knees. Garrett remained standing, unsure of where to begin. Apologies and humility weren't his strong suit. They were foreign territory, but he knew he had to try. "I owe you an apology," Garrett started, his tone measured but sincere. "What I did at the event? It wasn't right. I put you on the spot, and it wasn't about celebrating your talent. It was about trying to humiliate you. And I'm not proud of that." Abigail's eyes flicked up to meet his, her surprise evident. Of all the things she might have expected from Garrett Whitman, an apology wasn't one of them. This was the same arrogant businessman who had mocked her in front of an entire room, and now he stood in her living room, acknowledging his wrongdoing. "I've thought a lot about that night," he continued. "And I realize now that I was wrong about you. You're not just a waitress or someone to dismiss. Your music. It's something extraordinary. It's special." Abigail crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly, though a guarded edge remained. "So why are you here?" she asked, her voice calm but skeptical. "To make yourself feel better? To make amends?" Garrett paused, carefully choosing his next words. "Partially," he admitted. "But more than that, I came because I believe you have the potential to do something incredible, and I want to help you get there." Abigail blinked, visibly taken aback. Of all the outcomes she might have imagined, this wasn't one of them. She had expected condescension, or perhaps another attempt to exert control. She hadn't expected him to offer help. "Help me? Why?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Because you've got something that money can't buy," Garrett replied, his voice steady and firm. "Passion, raw talent. I've spent my life building empires and controlling outcomes, but I've never seen anyone play the way you did that night. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago." Abigail's expression shifted slightly, her guard softening as she studied him. For the first time, she saw something in Garrett's eyes that wasn't arrogance or calculation. There was sincerity there, a glimpse of the person beneath the polished exterior. "I lost that a long time ago," Garrett admitted, his voice quieter now. "And I don't want to see you throw it away because you didn't have the support you needed." Abigail stared at him, her arms still crossed defensively. But the sincerity in Garrett's voice was undeniable, and for the first time, she saw something different in him. The cold, calculating man she had known seemed to have softened, revealing a humanity she hadn't expected. "You think I can make it?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Garrett didn't hesitate. "I know you can, and I want to help you do it. Leonard Chastain sees it too. He's giving you an opportunity most people could only dream of. But talent alone isn't enough to succeed in this world. You'll need resources, guidance, and connections to get where you deserve to be." Abigail took a deep breath, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to turn him away, to reject his offer and close the door on this chaotic chapter of her life. But another part, the part that had dreamed of being a violinist since she was a child, refused to ignore the chance she was being given. "All right," she said finally, meeting his gaze with newfound determination. "I'll accept your help, but don't think this means I trust you." Garrett nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough. I'll earn it." And with that, they stood on the edge of something new, a tentative partnership built on shared purpose. Garrett had made his decision, and now it was up to both of them to see it through. The lights of the concert hall flickered above Abigail as she stood backstage, clutching her violin case. She could hear the faint hum of the audience settling into their seats beyond the thick curtain, their anticipation palpable. The air buzzed with energy, and Abigail could feel it in every nerve. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for weeks. Her first performance as a soloist with the orchestra. Her first real chance to prove herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the shoulder rest on her violin. The nerves were impossible to ignore, but beneath them was a simmering sense of determination. She had come a long way from that humiliating night at Garrett's event, where she had turned an attempted mockery into an unexpected triumph. And now, with Leonard Chastain's mentorship and Garrett's surprising support, she stood at the brink of something life-changing. Leonard's guidance had been instrumental in preparing her for this night. His rehearsals were grueling, pushing her to her limits, but they had shaped her into a more polished and confident musician. Day after day, Abigail had poured every ounce of energy into perfecting the concerto she would perform tonight. The piece was challenging, yet breathtaking, a true test of her abilities. Despite all the preparation, the doubts lingered. The stakes were impossibly high, and Abigail knew this performance could define her future. The other musicians in the Philharmonic were seasoned professionals with years of experience. Despite all her progress, she still felt like an outsider. But Leonard had reminded her time and again, it wasn't about perfection, it was about heart. And heart was something Abigail had in abundance. As she waited for her cue to take the stage, the backstage door creaked open, and Garrett walked in. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but his expression was softer than she had ever seen it. There was no trace of the arrogance or sharp edges that had characterized their first interactions. Instead, his eyes held something warmer: pride. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but tinged with concern. Abigail swallowed hard, her nerves momentarily tightening their grip on her. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've practiced, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. Garrett stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You're going to be amazing," he said firmly. "You've worked hard for this. You deserve to be here." Abigail blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. She had accepted his help, but a part of her had remained wary, uncertain of his true intentions. Yet in that moment, she saw no ulterior motive, only encouragement. Over the past few weeks, he had begun to feel less like the man who had tried to embarrass her and more like someone who genuinely believed in her potential. And tonight, that belief was what she needed most. Garrett had revealed a side of himself Abigail never expected, a side that seemed genuinely invested in her success, not for his own benefit, but because he truly believed in her. "Thank you," Abigail said softly, meeting his gaze. "I'm nervous, but I'm ready." Garrett nodded, offering a rare, small smile. "Good, I'll be out there, watching." With that, he stepped back, giving her the space she needed. Moments later, the stage manager's voice echoed backstage. It was time. Abigail took a deep breath, gripping her violin case tightly. The familiar weight of the instrument grounded her, reminding her of all the countless hours she'd spent practicing, dreaming, and fighting for this moment. This was her chance. She had to seize it. The applause of the audience swelled as the conductor took his place at the podium. Abigail stepped out onto the stage, her heart pounding as the bright lights hit her. The concert hall was massive, far grander than any venue she had ever played in. The audience, hundreds of faces, disappeared into the shadows beyond the glaring lights. But she knew they were there, watching, waiting. She walked to the center of the stage, the orchestra behind her. As she positioned herself, her eyes darted across the darkened crowd. Somewhere out there, Garrett was watching, along with Leonard Chastain and dozens of influential figures in the music world. The pressure was immense, but Abigail couldn't let it consume her. The conductor raised his baton, and the first notes of the orchestra filled the hall. Soft, deliberate, and beautiful. Abigail felt her nerves spike as she lifted her bow to the strings. Her hands trembled for just a moment, but then, as the first note left her violin, the tension melted away. The music poured out of her, effortless and fluid, as if it had been waiting inside her all along. Each note resonated with the passion, emotion, and struggle she had carried with her through this journey. The melody wrapped itself around the audience, pulling them into the world she created with her violin. All the late-night rehearsals, the doubts, the fears, they vanished in this moment. There was no room for them. There was only the music, and Abigail gave herself entirely to it. Her fingers moved with confidence, her bow dancing across the strings with precision and grace. The audience was utterly captivated. The room was silent, the air thick with awe as they hung on every note. Abigail had lost herself in the music, letting it guide her. When the final note echoed through the hall and faded into silence, Abigail slowly lowered her violin. Her chest heaved as she caught her breath. For a moment, the room was completely still, as though everyone was holding their breath. Then it began. The applause started softly, hesitant at first, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. The sound engulfed her, filling the concert hall with warmth and admiration. Abigail stood there, her heart racing as the applause washed over her. She had done it. She had performed in front of a crowd that demanded perfection, and she had given them something more, something real, something filled with heart. As her eyes scanned the crowd, she spotted Garrett near the back of the room. He was standing, clapping along with everyone else, his expression one of quiet pride. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Abigail realized how far she had come. Not just for herself, but for them both. This was a new beginning. As she stepped off the stage, the sound of the applause still ringing in her ears, Abigail's heart pounded with the thrill of what had just happened. She had done it. After everything, the late nights, the self-doubt, the fears, she had performed in front of a packed concert hall and received a standing ovation. It felt surreal, as though she were floating in a dream. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Musicians congratulated her with warm smiles and words of praise. The energy of the moment surrounded her, lifting her spirits even higher. Leonard Chastain was waiting for her, his eyes twinkling with approval. "That was extraordinary, Abigail," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "You played with heart, exactly as I knew you would." "Thank you, Leonard," Abigail replied, breathless and beaming. I can't believe this is real." "It is real," Leonard assured her with a proud smile. "And this is just the beginning. You have a bright future ahead of you." "I lost that part of myself a long time ago," Garrett admitted, his voice softer now. "And I don't want to see you lose what makes you special, because you didn't have the support you deserve." Abigail stared at him, her arms still crossed, but the walls she had built around herself began to crack. There was a sincerity in his words that felt different. For the first time, Garrett didn't seem like the cold, calculating man she had known. He seemed human. "You think I can really do this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with vulnerability. "I don't just think so, I know you can," Garrett replied without hesitation. "But there's more to this than just talent. You have something unique, Abigail, and I want to help you reach your potential. That's why I'm here." The weight of his words hit her, but Abigail's mind kept circling back to something else. Something she had been wondering ever since that first night. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Garrett," she began, her voice steadier now, "I need to ask you something. That melody, the one I played at your event, it's been part of my family for as long as I can remember. My grandfather taught it to me, but we never knew where it came from. How did you recognize it?" Garrett's expression shifted, the calmness giving way to something deeper, almost pained. He looked down briefly, gathering his thoughts, before meeting her gaze again. "It wasn't just the melody that struck me," Garrett began, his voice low and serious. "It was the way you played it. That piece, it was written by my mother." Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Your mother?" she asked, barely able to form the words. How could that be possible? Garrett nodded, his gaze distant, as if he were pulling the memories from a place he hadn't touched in years. "My mother was a musician, a gifted one. She wrote that piece a long time ago, but she never shared it with anyone outside of our home. It was something she played for me when I was a boy. After she passed, I never heard it again, until you played it that night." Abigail felt a chill run through her. The melody her grandfather had passed down to her, one she thought was just a family tradition, had originated with Garrett's mother. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett stepped closer, his expression serious but gentle. "There's more," he said, his tone filled with weight. "After that night I started looking into it. I couldn't figure out how you knew that melody. It didn't make sense, until I found the connection." Abigail's heart pounded as he spoke. She felt the ground shifting beneath her, the pieces of her life rearranging into something unrecognizable. "Your grandfather," Garrett said slowly, his eyes locking onto hers, "was my mother's first love." The words hit her like a thunderclap, hanging heavy in the air. "My grandfather knew your mother?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Garrett nodded solemnly. "Yes, they were together before she met my father. But there's more, Abigail." He paused, as if bracing himself. "Your mother, the one who raised you, isn't your biological mother." The world seemed to tilt. Abigail took a step back, her mind spinning as she tried to process what he was saying. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "That can't be." Garrett's voice softened. "I know it's a lot to take in, but it's true. After my mother passed, your grandfather raised you as his own, keeping your real mother's identity a secret. He didn't want you to be pulled into the life my father created, a world of power and wealth that destroyed her." Abigail felt tears well up in her eyes as the truth crashed down on her. Her entire life had been built on a foundation she hadn't known was a lie. Garrett's mother, her mother, the melody that had connected them was more than just music. It was a bridge to a shared past neither of them had understood until now. Garrett stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not alone, Abigail," he said softly. "You've never been alone. We're family." Abigail looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. But amidst the overwhelming revelation, there was something else: peace. For the first time, it felt like the missing pieces of her life had finally fallen into place. She wasn't alone. She had found her family, and together, she and Garrett could move forward, honoring the memory of the mother they both shared. This was the start of something new, a beginning neither of them had expected, but one they were ready to face together.